By the time the story reaches its sixth season, the series has spent years painstakingly training the audience in the internal physics of its underworld. What earns a laugh? What earns a fine? What earns a hospital visit? And what earns a funeral? It is a world where etiquette is not a garnish, but a survival mechanism, where respect is treated less like a virtue and more like oxygen. So when Paulie delivers a joke about Christopher's infant daughter, effectively proposing her future as a stripper, and the room responds with broad amusement and puzzled irritation at Christopher's sensitivity, the moment lands with the grace of a piano dropped into a china shop. Not because such a joke would be unacceptable in polite society. Polite society is not the operating system here. The problem is that the show has already built a remarkably consistent model of what does and does not fly in this mob ecosystem. And that scene behaves as if those rules have quietly been patched out overnight. The most jarring element is not even the insult itself. It is the collective reaction. This is a crew that treats family, and especially daughters, as sacred property, a posture repeated so often it becomes a credo. When it comes to daughters, all bets are off is not an incidental line. It is practically a mission statement for the season, and it foreshadows the kind of grievance that escalates into open conflict. The series has demonstrated, with almost documentary patience, that perceived disrespect toward a man's family can become a political event. There is a precedent so glaring it is impossible to ignore. Johnny Sack's rage over a joke about Ginny, a remark that detonates relationships and requires high-level management to keep the peace. By comparison, a made man being told publicly to his face that his baby girl will be stripping should not produce light chuckles and mild confusion. It should produce consequences, a sit-down, a tax, a sustained campaign of revenge, or, at minimum, an unmistakable social recoil. Instead, nothing happens, no one blinks, and the scene continues as if the room has temporarily forgotten how the culture works. This is why the moment can feel unrealistic within the show's reality, even if it might be believable in some other gangster property. A helicopter gunship could certainly solve a narrative problem in a different kind of mafia story. It would also feel absurdly out of place in this one. The series usually resists that kind of tonal betrayal. It thrives on the mundane precision of cruelty, not spectacle. And yet this particular exchange arrives like an imported set piece from a broader, louder genre, one that mistakes shock value for authenticity, and everyone laughs for character truth. Of course, it is not difficult to identify what the scene is trying to accomplish. It is a blunt instrument meant to force a realization. Christopher is not cherished, and more importantly, he is not respected. This is the same logic that underpins Paulie's notorious intervention takedown, where he summarizes Christopher as weak, out of control, and humiliating. That message is not subtle elsewhere. It is a refrain. The joke scene functions as a public demonstration of that verdict, less an insult to the child than a ritual humiliation of the father. The first two cracks in the exchange are not primarily about the daughter at all. They are about Christopher, bait designed to expose his slow processing, his poor instincts, his inability to respond competently. The room is not merely laughing at a punchline. It is laughing at a man who cannot defend his own status in a language he is supposed to be fluent in. The mob is, among other things, a workplace built on improvisation and dominance displays. Christopher freezes, fumbles, and looks disconnected. He does not clap back, does not draw a boundary early, does not project any convincing authority. The laughter becomes a referendum on his weakness. That interpretation helps explain the intent, but it does not fully solve the structural problem. The show has always been willing to embarrass Christopher. It has also always been careful about the symbolic boundaries around wives and daughters. because those boundaries are not moral, they are operational. If the humiliation needed to be unmistakable, there were a dozen ways to stage it without violating the universe's established reactions. The choice to have the entire room join in, including figures who routinely posture about rules, creates the impression that the writers needed a neon sign and were willing to bend the world to hang it. And when a show's greatest strength is its consistency of social logic, bending the world is not a small indulgence. It is a crack in the foundation. There is a plausible counterargument. Perhaps the scene is not as objective as it appears. In a crowded room, not everyone will hear every line, and not every burst of laughter is necessarily directed at the same target. The scene is shot with a faint suggestion of unreality, allowing the possibility that Christopher, inebriated, high, or emotionally primed, perceives the room as laughing at him more uniformly than it actually is. In that reading, the moment becomes less a documentary record and more a subjective experience of humiliation, amplified by paranoia and self-loathing. That interpretation has the merit of aligning with the character. Christopher is the type to internalize disrespect, to spiral, to interpret ambient noise as indictment. It also conveniently explains why the room's reaction seems so culturally wrong. But even that defense has limits. The scene still places the joke itself in the open, still frames the exchange as audible, still has key figures respond, and still uses the moment as a narrative pivot. If the goal was psychological distortion, it is executed with enough clarity that the audience is asked to accept a social impossibility as literal, unless they volunteer to rescue it. The bigger picture is that this is part of a late series drift, the gradual recalibration of everyone toward greater ugliness and reduced loyalty. Early on, the story made space for an uncomfortable kind of affection. Tony agonizes, weeps, and collapses under the weight of what must be done to someone like Pussy. The violence is terrible, but the emotional cost is treated as real. Later, Tony contemplates killing Paulie because he is annoying, inconvenient, or simply tiresome. The crew that once behaved like a warped family increasingly resembles a set of coworkers competing for oxygen in a sinking office. Season 1's rough loyalty, evil when necessary but broadly cohesive, gives way to a colder ecosystem of opportunists and grudges. In that context, a room laughing at Christopher's humiliation is not a total departure. It is an escalation of a long-term thesis. The rules are slogans, and the only binding principle is who currently holds power. And no character embodies that thesis quite like Paulie Walnuts, the series' most durable parasite. He is not merely comic relief. He is an engine of damage. Over the course of the story, he causes problems for nearly everyone. Incessant gossiping, reckless antagonism, and a steady habit of feeding conflicts that any competent criminal would avoid. He runs his mouth about sensitive matters that should never leave the room. He undermines allies over money. He makes himself a permanent adolescent in a suit, desperate for attention, forever measuring status by proximity to the boss. This is a man who behaves like a teenager who cannot tolerate being ignored, except the consequences of his tantrums include violence and war. By any rational calculus of organizational self-preservation, he should have been eliminated long before the final stretch. That Tony even debates it, most memorably during the boat episode, feels less like cruelty and more like overdue performance management. Paulie's most revealing trait is not his brutality. Plenty of characters are brutal. It is his survivability. He is the career middle manager of this criminal enterprise, never visionary, never indispensable, always ready to adjust his sails to whichever way the winds blow, and perpetually convinced he is the aggrieved party. His cheapness is not a quirk, it is a worldview. He treats money as proof of love and status, and he treats any distribution that does not favor him as betrayal. He can be mentoring to Christopher in the way a bad supervisor is mentoring, offering practical advice, sleep, discipline, the incompatibility of marriage and the life, while simultaneously sabotaging, humiliating, and nudging relapse when it suits his ego. He is the sort who can hand someone a life lesson with one hand and pick their pocket with the other, then act shocked when called on it. That famous line about marriage not jiving with the thing is, maddeningly, one of the clearest statements of thematic truth in the series. The story repeatedly demonstrates that criminal success and a stable family life are fundamentally incompatible. Not because criminals lack sentiment, but because their daily practices, lying, exploiting, cheating, gambling, drinking, disappearing, are incompatible with any coherent ethical model to pass on to children. The hypocrisy is thick enough to cut with a shovel, demanding respect, preaching discipline, telling kids not to swear or steal, while making a living entirely from theft and intimidation, and spending nights in vice. Paulie's advice is correct, even as his life is a monument to why it is necessary. The show's obsession with hypocrisy is also why comparisons between different lines matter. Consider how the world reacts when Meadow is insulted. Tony responds with spectacular violence against Coco, an act that carries political implications and arguably contributes to the larger endgame. Now contrast that with Paulie making comments about Christopher's daughter and receiving laughter. The disparity is not an accident, it is the point. Rules are invoked when useful and discarded when inconvenient. The crew's ethical outrage is selective and power-based. Tony's authority, fear factor, and network make his retaliation predictable. Christopher, by contrast, is widely perceived as a liability. Drug problems, immaturity, self-pity, and a rank inflated by blood ties rather than competence. That is why Paulie can take liberties with him. Paulie knows Christopher will not do anything effective, and he knows no one will do anything on Christopher's behalf. This is also where the question of sanction becomes important. In theory, killing a made man is not something one simply does in a fit of temper. The mythology of the organization insists on sit-downs, permissions, proper channels. In practice, by late series, the Jersey crew is breaking norms constantly because the norms were never sacred, they were tools. Still, it is reasonable to ask whether Christopher could have killed Paulie, especially given their long-running conflict, the panties incident, the Pine Barrens debacle, the home invasion intimidation, and the public humiliations, and survived politically. The strict answer is that it would require authorization and a compelling reason, and absent that, the killer would be marked. The functional answer, consistent with the show's thesis, is more cynical. The outcome would depend on who wanted what in the moment, and whether the killing could be rationalized as necessary. The rules are not laws, they are talking points. The relationship between Paulie and Christopher illustrates how these rules collapse under personality. Paulie declares during Christopher's induction that if there is a problem, it should be taken to Tony. When Christopher does exactly that, Paulie threatens him for it. The institution advertises process. The people punish anyone who tries to use it. This is not a contradiction to be resolved. It is the system functioning as designed. The organization survives by encouraging dependence and punishing autonomy. It does not want orderly dispute resolution. It wants hierarchy reaffirmed through fear. Even in comedic side plots, the same logic applies. The infamous waiter incident is a miniature ethics seminar taught with a blunt instrument. The waiter is not wrong to feel cheated, but confronting volatile customers in a parking lot at night over a tip is an act of spectacular miscalculation. It is not deserved, and it is certainly not morally just, but it is predictably dangerous. The tragedy is that he thinks the situation will follow the rules of customer service, an environment where complaints can yield compensation, and instead finds himself in an environment where complaints can yield injury or death. Paulie and Christopher behave as monsters, and the show never pretends otherwise. The point is that monsters do not respond to moral appeals, especially when those appeals threaten their pride. There is also an institutional critique embedded here. Any restaurant hosting large parties without a clear gratuity policy is inviting disaster for staff. Being stiffed on a small check is annoying. Being stiffed on a massive tab after dedicating an entire shift is the kind of professional insult that can break a person's patience. The waiter's move is unwise, but the system that put him in that position is not exactly commendable either. The same mixture of strategic failure and dark comedy powers the Pine Barrens material. Questions about why Paulie does not simply use Christopher's body heat for warmth, or why the situation is not handled with basic outdoor survival tactics, are the kind of absurd logic audits that highlight the episode's intended contrast. These are city predators dropped into a natural environment where their social skills are useless. The notion of crawling under someone for warmth becomes an accidental commentary on their masculinity performance. They can commit violence without blinking, but they cannot tolerate intimacy even when it is practical. The episode toys with this discomfort, and the surrounding reactions range from juvenile panic to mock-serious medical excuses. The humor lands because the characters' identities are so brittle that simple survival feels like an existential threat. Then there is Valerie, the so-called interior decorator, the man whose legend grows in the telling, and the perennial question of why he does not simply finish Paulie and Christopher when he has them down. From a cold tactical perspective, the criticism is straightforward. He knocks them down with a shovel, has a window of advantage, and instead flees into the woods in the snow. It looks like a baffling choice. But there are plausible explanations that preserve internal logic without turning the episode into a superhero film. He may be disoriented, concussed, or panicked. A violent encounter is not a chess match. He may also be making a rational calculation. He is in pajamas, outnumbered by firearms, and one more second in close range could be fatal. Running is not cowardice. It is sometimes the only sane move. The fact that action movies often teach audiences to expect a prolonged hand-to-hand struggle, followed by a dramatic reversal, does not obligate this show to follow suit. The point is that chaos is often messy, anticlimactic, and driven by fear. And the lingering shock that Valerie never reappears speaks to the show's talent for weaponizing unfinished business. The missing thread becomes its own form of dread. All of this loops back to the central tragedy, Christopher's end. The arc often feels rushed not because it lacks meaning, but because it is so brutally efficient. After the public humiliations, the relapses, the diminishing patience, and Tony's growing disgust, Christopher's death lands like a final administrative decision. Tony is simply over it. There is nuance, of course. Resentment, betrayal, fatigue, a long history of disappointment, but the efficiency is the point. In a healthier story, a character like Christopher might survive long enough to flip, wear a wire, and testify, exposing everything and dragging the Enterprise into court. That might even be the most realistic legal outcome. It would also be a fundamentally different show, one that trades moral rot for procedural closure. The series does not do closure. It does erosion. A neat courtroom ending would not be better, it would be tidier, and tidiness is not the product being sold. So the Paulie joke scene sits at an uncomfortable intersection of themes. On one hand, it aligns with the late series' insistence that respect is not earned by rank alone, that blood ties are not the same as competence, and that a man can be made and still be treated like a nuisance. It demonstrates that Christopher's greatest ambition, to be feared and respected, has curdled into its opposite. He is tolerated, mocked, and quietly written off. On the other hand, the staging risks undermining the show's own sociology by asking the audience to accept a reaction that contradicts years of carefully laid precedent about family insult as a trigger for violence and war. The easiest reconciliation is to treat the scene as psychological distortion, a blurred moment of intoxicated humiliation, rather than a literal consensus of the room. The harsher reconciliation is to treat it as a deliberate signal that the world has decayed so far that even its most cherished taboos can be violated when the target lacks clout. Either way, the scene accomplishes what it came to do. It breaks something in Christopher. The cruelty is not only the insult, it is the realization that the insult can happen publicly and nothing will be done. That is a different kind of violence, quiet, social, absolute. It is also the perfect encapsulation of the show's bleak argument about rules. The organization preaches codes, loyalty, and honor, then operates like a marketplace of fear, where every principle is negotiable. In that marketplace, Paulie survives because he is adaptable, shameless, and always positioned just close enough to power to make retaliation expensive. Christopher fails because he cannot stabilize his own identity long enough to command the respect he believes he is owed. Tony thrives until his own hypocrisy becomes too large to manage, enforcing boundaries on behalf of his family while eroding them everywhere else, and confusing violence for authority until even authority begins to feel like a rumor. And that is the uncomfortable brilliance of it. The system is not inconsistent because the writers forgot the rules. It is inconsistent because the rules were never real. They were always performance, until performance could no longer hold. The only question the series ultimately answers is not what is allowed, but who is allowed to do it, and what everyone else is willing to pretend they didn't hear. Subscribe